Welcome back to the Foxhole. I'm your host, James Rosen, coming to you from the Washington Bureau of Fox News. One of the great epic films of the 1990s was Steven Spielberg's Oscar-winning Saving Private Ryan, about the effort to extract a soldier from the war theater in Europe because his three brothers had already been killed in action and the government wanted to spare Mrs. Ryan the anguish of losing all four of her sons. The film was based on real-life stories of World War II, wherein a mother in the American heartland would receive 2 or even 3 death telegrams from the armed forces on the same day. Our own time, this anxious post-9/11 age, is producing stories no less wrenching, and among the most painful and thought-provoking is the one related in The Invisible Front, Love and Loss in an Era of Endless War, published recently by Crown. It tells the story of U.S. Army Major General Mark Graham, a decorated 2-star officer whose last assignment, capping a 34-year military career, was serving as Deputy Chief of Staff for FORSCOM, the Army's largest command. General Graham and his wife Carol had a daughter and 2 sons, Jeff and Kevin, who, inspired by their father's example, decided to pursue the military on their own. In June 2003, however, Kevin Graham, an ROTC cadet known to friends and family as an intelligent, athletic, and well-liked young man, took his own life. Though he was seeing a psychologist at the University of Kentucky, Kevin had largely kept his depression a secret. 8 months later, on February 19, 2004, Kevin's brother, Army 2nd Lieutenant Jeffrey Graham, was killed by an improvised explosive device while leading a foot patrol in Chaldea in the Al-Anbar province of central Iraq. Here, to take the story from there, is the author of The Invisible Front, my colleague and friend, Yoki Dreesen, the managing editor of Foreign Policy, who covered the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq for the Wall Street Journal. I first met Yoki in Iraq back in 2006. My friend, thank you finally for getting here to the Foxhole to visit with us. Mostly on our account. We had a number of cancellations, things, but we're very grateful that you came.
It's my pleasure. Thanks, James.
How long did it take you to write this book?
This book, the actual writing was a year, but it grew out of a profile I had done of the family for the Wall Street Journal in 2009. We became close friends almost immediately, in part, to be very candid, because some of the issues that Kevin wrestled with, some of the issues that Mark confronted when he was trying to change the culture of PTSD in the military, were things I was confronting, having spent several years covering the wars both in Iraq and Afghanistan. So the family and I became very close. I think they could see that in me. We stayed close over the years, and it led to the book.
The deaths of these 2 sons in late 2003 and early 2004, how long was it after that that you became involved with the Graham family?
It was 2009. 2009 was when I started to hear from military friends of mine. You know, like you mentioned before, it was we met in Iraq. It was a place I spent a lot of time. But military friends back here would say to me, "I'm not the same person as I was when I left. I look in the mirror, I don't recognize myself. I could see my wife look at me, and she's seeing me differently. My children are scared of me. I can't sleep. I feel flashes of anger at waiters." Some of them said, "I've thought about killing myself. I don't want to live like this." And I would hear secondhand of people I knew, in some cases friends, who did kill themselves. And I was looking at the numbers and watching them tick higher and higher and higher. And in the halls of the Pentagon, when I would hear this name, Mark Graham, somebody who was trying to fight it, Mark Graham, again and again, people would say he lost 2 sons. And James, that was unimaginable to me to hear. The idea of losing 1 child was, I would think of your world ending. The idea of losing 2, your world would end a second time. And I decided I would try to find out more about who this man was and what it was that he was trying to do. We met in 2009 at Fort Carson, spent several days together there. It led to that long story, to a friendship, and then to this book.
And General Graham undertook this campaign starting when?
He undertook it in some ways after Kevin's death. That's what put onto his own radar screen that a person could look exactly the same as they did 6 months earlier, a day earlier, a week earlier, but inside what you couldn't see is that they had changed, so they were spiraling down. And he was aware of that for the first time in the most tragic way possible. It was after mourning the loss of his son and trying to figure out what could they have done differently. And as he ascended, he oversaw the military evacuation of New Orleans after Katrina and ascended higher and higher and higher. At each stop, he tried to figure out ways of making a broken system better. He ultimately was in command of Fort Carson. This is one of the largest bases in the country. It's in Colorado. It's a beautiful place. It's ringed by mountains. It's really stunning. But when he got there, it had both one of the highest suicide rates and a high murder rate. Soldiers killing other soldiers, soldiers killing civilians. This is the base that Mark Graham inherited. And so suddenly he had a responsibility to fix a broken base and the power to try to fix a broken base. And that's what he set out to do.
And did his taking over the command of that base coincide with the death of his younger son, or his second son, I should say, or?
Jeff, and this is among the many tragedies, it's sort of one of the more heartbreaking ones. Jeff was killed a year later. So
not even really, right?
It was like
8 months.
Yeah, like 9 or 10 months. Kevin dies. The family is shattered by that death. Jeff is told. You mentioned the Private Ryan example. Jeff is told by his father, "I can keep you back. You don't have to go. I can find a way for you to stay where it's safe." And he said, "My men deserve me. I need to go. I have to be there for them." He didn't have men then. He wasn't like he had been in command, and he went anyway. To this day, Mark and his wife Carol are haunted by the thought of maybe if they had pulled a string and kept him, Jeff would still have lived. He would still have survived. When he was killed, and he died in the most heroic way possible, he was carrying Kevin's driver's license in his wallet. And Mark and Carol comfort themselves as best they can by thinking these two brothers were so close in life that at the moment of death they were together again.
It reminds me of the very first and overriding thing you always heard from veterans who came back from Iraq or Afghanistan with one limb left, 2 limbs left, which was always invariably, all I want is to get back to my unit.
That's right. And it's an amazing thing. I mean, you and I have both experienced it and probably had the same reaction of, oh my God, you can be back here, you can be pitying yourself, rightfully.
Because the coffee machine doesn't work.
Exactly.
Right? I mean,
and you hear from these men and these women devotion to service. You hear a complete lack of self-pity. The challenge in some ways for men like Kevin Graham or men who have taken their lives since with PTSD is that their wounds are not visible. If you or I see someone who is roughly in their 20s missing a limb, we could think this man served in Iraq, he lost his leg. We can look at that same man who is not missing a limb, not know he had served, not know he had been changed. And it's that difference between a wound you can see and the one you can't. That's really what Mark has fought against his whole life.
Our visitor to the Foxhole today is Yoki Driesen, managing editor of Foreign Policy and author of The Invisible Front, Love and Loss in an Era of Endless War, published recently by Crown. It is the story of a distinguished military family struggling to cope with the deaths of 2 sons, one killed in Iraq, the other a case of suicide, and to change the culture of the United States military. What for you was the most difficult part of this project?
The most difficult part was asking Mark and Carol, who have at this point become family to me, but asking them to relive again and again in as much detail as they could remember and muster what are the most painful moments of their lives. Because to the day they die, they will always think they missed signs with Kevin. If they had been better parents, maybe they'd have seen that he was depressed, that he was at a point where he could take his own life. And they will blame themselves for that till the day they die. And with Jeff, they will blame themselves until the day they die that they didn't keep him back. So these are extraordinary people, brave people, strong people. And I had to keep asking them again and again, tell me about what you remember. Tell me about that last day, that last phone call.
Are they, without meaning to pry, devout people?
They are.
And is that helping them to get through this?
It is in some ways, and it's not in a different way. It's complicated because they are religious, as am I, and that was a bond we had together. But for them, members of their family said of Kevin, he sinned by taking his own life. And because he sinned, he shouldn't get a church memorial service, he shouldn't be buried in a Christian cemetery. So within the family there was tension precisely because they were a religious family.
Yoki Driesen writes in The Invisible Front, and I quote, "In the years ahead, Mark and Carol would struggle to come to terms with their twin losses. They would draw purpose from their son's death by working to change the military that defined both their lives and those of Jeff and Kevin. They would fight to erase the stigma surrounding mental health in the Army and battle its growing suicide problem. Kevin hadn't served a day in the military when he killed himself, but Mark and Carol would come to understand that the factors that kept him from seeking help, stigma and the legitimate fear that he'd be drummed out of the military if his commanders discovered that he was on prescription medication, were the exact same ones that would lead hundreds of soldiers to take their own lives in the years ahead. They would become experts in post-traumatic stress disorder, the signature wound of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and one of the biggest causes of the suicide epidemic just beginning to spread through the military. They would learn that the Pentagon hadn't had remotely enough psychologists and psychiatrists to handle the flood of troops returning home from the wars with PTSD or depression, forcing some soldiers to wait so long for an appointment that they killed themselves before even seeing a counselor. Mark and Carol would also watch horrified as the numbers of soldiers taking their own lives grew larger and larger. The military suicide rate jumped more than 80% between 2002 and 2009, the first year that the percentage of troops who took their own lives was higher than the percentage of civilians who did so. In 2012, more soldiers died by their own hand than in combat. In 2013, the total number of military suicides since the start of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan passed the 1,000 mark. In 2014, the Pentagon disclosed that the suicide rate for male veterans aged 30 and younger had jumped 44% between 2009 and 2011, a startling figure that suggested that the number of younger soldiers choosing to take their own lives would continue to increase well into the future. That from the Invisible Front. And just explain the title for us.
It's trying to describe two things. One, that these are wounds you can't see. You could meet a person, not know that they have PTSD because you don't see a mark, you don't see a scratch, you don't see a missing limb. And also that this is the war of the future. Iraq is over. Afghanistan, most U.S. troops are leaving. That war, one way or another, is going to end. But this war against wounds you can't see, this war to help fight against PTSD, to fight against this scourge of military suicide, this will go on for decades to come. As part of the book, I interviewed General Ray Odierno, the current Chief of Staff of the Army, Bob Gates, the former Secretary of Defense. They both said the same thing, which I believe as well. We're not at the top yet. We are not anywhere near the top. PTSD can take decades to flare up.
If you will.
Exactly. The suicide numbers, we haven't seen them stop and start to decline. It could take decades before PTSD really flares up. You have now 80,000 soldiers basically being fired out of a shrinking military. These are men and women who thought they would serve 20 years, that would be their life, and now they're being fired. They're being told we have no space for you.
These statistics raise a few questions, it seems to me, about the conduct of war. It's not just that the wars are endless or go on so long, it's about the way we fight wars. So, for example, it has been seen as a positive development that we can save more soldiers, warfighters, on the battlefield than we used to. In the Civil War, say, or World War I even, a given soldier suffering a given wound was going to die, and probably a slow and grisly death on the battlefield. Today we can get to that individual, medevac him or her where they need to go, but it means they're going to spend the rest of their lives as an amputee or what have you, and in some ways one might wonder if that's a crueler fate. I think Lieutenant Dan in Forrest Gump explored that, the character explored that. Another issue raised by this is we like to think of ourselves as living in an age when we conduct war by remote control from Northern Virginia with drones, etc. And yet we're seeing this profound spike in mental illness as a result, and PTSD and so forth. Does that strike you as, are people wrong to think that we're fighting war by remote control and therefore these things should be easier? Can someone, in fact, even just pushing buttons and killing people from Northern Virginia experience PTSD?
They can, and they do, and they are. You're seeing rates of combat stress, of PTSD, of nightmares among drone operators spike. There are some studies suggesting that they are as high among drone operators as they are among actual combat pilots. So we think of the guys flying over Iraq and dropping a bomb. We think of the guys sitting in a trailer with a joystick, and the rates are kind of the same. And I think it gets back to the first point you raised. If you and I were on patrol together with a third friend who we knew, who we loved at this point, and a bomb went off and took off his legs, we would spend our moment trying to save his life. Hopefully he survived, but then for the two of us, we would never be the same again. We would wonder why him, not us. We would feel guilty that it was him and not us. We would be changed by it even if we weren't wounded by it. Same with drone operators. These guys are looking down at American troops in combat. And it's HD. They can see the hair on their head watching a troop, let's say, an American soldier get shot, and they can't help. So the kind of guilt you could have if you lost them on the battlefield, you can have if you're watching it in a drone camera.
I'm going to imagine that you have been exposed to a line of thought. And in putting it to you, I don't mean to suggest that I actually believe this, but have people said to you in the course of your research for this project, look, this is as war has ever been. It was ever thus. Right? It was always an awful business. War is hell. Why is it that today's war fighters are experiencing PTSD or suicide in higher percentages than the men who liberated Dachau, or the men who fought at Antietam, who survived Antietam, or what have you? And I think there's probably some people who would be tempted to say that's just because we live in an age today where everyone's encouraged to complain or to file a claim of some kind, whereas in John Wayne's day, men were men and they took their punishment and they went about their lives when the awfulness was over. Have you been exposed to that kind of thing, and what is the correct answer?
I have heard that before. It's worth remembering that PTSD as a diagnosis didn't exist until the 80s, but the notion of being changed by combat, the notion of the horrors of combat and what it does to the psyche, this has existed for millennia under different names. It was shell shock, it was some of the other terms that were used during World War II. In the course of researching the book, I discovered that there were 500,000 troops, 500,000, who during World War II were discharged because of what we would now consider PTSD. And this was the greatest generation. These were the men who stormed Normandy. 500,000 of them were sent home. So this is not a new issue. To your other question of why now, I think we are more sensitive to it. And there's good and there's bad. I think people now are more aware that there could be something wrong with them that they didn't see. A World War II veteran might not have been self-aware in that same way. And the risk of that, of course, is if you feel like you've changed, if you understand that change may never go away, that it may be a permanent wound, you may find yourself heading down the path that says, I need a way out.
Our visitor to the Foxhole today is Yoki Driesen, managing editor of Foreign Policy and author of The Invisible Front, Love and Loss in an Era of Endless War. Published recently by Crown, it is the story of a distinguished military family struggling to cope with the deaths of two sons, one killed in Iraq, the other a case of suicide, and their effort to change the culture of the United States military. You're a reporter. You're one of the best in this city for a long time now. Respected across both the journalism and the national security establishments. Did your work on this book change your conclusions about the rationales for these wars and whether they were in fact worth fighting?
Less about the rationales, but more about the cost. You know, when we think of Iraq, the number that you see the shorthand of Iraq, which cost $1 trillion, and whatever the number of dead and number of wounded. And those are valid, especially the number of dead, these shattered families that will never recover. But I wasn't quite as aware of how many people in a profound, lasting way will be changed. The estimates are you might have 30% of the troops who served with PTSD. So now you're talking hundreds of thousands of veterans who will have this wound that they can't see, that others can't see, for the rest of their lives. And that notion of the cost of it, that it's not the 4,000 or 5,000 dead, it's not the 15,000 or 20,000 who have horrible burns or who had lost limbs, but it's hundreds of thousands. And of that, some percentage who will be haunted, unable to work, some percentage who will kill themselves. That was new to me. I hadn't thought of it in those terms.
All right, and so, but I again put the question to you of whether now that you are apprised more fully of the costs of these engagements, do you feel that we should have undertaken them?
That's such a hard question that I'm not trying to dodge. I think that you can make a stronger case for the necessity of Afghanistan. You can also make a strong case, and this is my own personal feeling based on reporting, that we were there too long. We had victory. We had accomplished what we set out to accomplish, and we could have called it a day and left it to the Afghans. Iraq, you know, this will be debated until the end of time. Did our presence there not only lead to this cost among Americans, but also hundreds of thousands of Iraqi dead, potentially the rise of the Islamic State, the dissolution of borders with Syria? Finding people who believe that the Iraq War is a good idea, that the Iraq War is worth not only the human cost to us, but also to Iraqis, to the region, you're not finding those voices. You're not finding people who are willing to go out there and say, yep, it was worth it. It was a good idea.
Even in the military, or perhaps especially in the military?
Especially within the military.
The question I guess one has to pursue, and necessarily it plunges us into the realm of the counterfactual, is what would the history of this region have been without our intervention?
Right, and the other thing you hear in the military, the military, James, as you know, it sort of tells itself a story. So post-Vietnam, the story was, we would have won if not for that micromanaging White House. That if you didn't have President Johnson picking targeting lists, we might have won that war.
Or the kids protesting on the campuses, right, and the news media and so on. Those
exactly.
are other narratives.
Exactly. Those three strands. You hear something similar now with Iraq. You're beginning to hear many in the military say, yeah, we bungled it, maybe we shouldn't have invaded, but set that aside. You're hearing them say, if we had done a better job post-surge of trying to stabilize what we had gained at tremendous cost, maybe Iraq wouldn't be what it is today. So they're sort of setting aside the should we have invaded. They're acknowledging many years of mismanagement, but they're also saying, hey, what you're seeing now with the Islamic State, that's not us. That's the civilian policymakers back home. And I think that will be the narrative of Iraq. It will be, we had it, it was frittered away. That will be what they tell themselves.
The outcome of the Iraq War, do we know the outcome of the Iraq War?
No. I think we can say two things definitively. Hundreds of thousands of people have lost their lives, and we can say that what had been Iraq and had been Syria, that were distinct countries, that part of that border is gone and will never come back. Whether it's the Islamic State, whether it's something different, whatever takes root in that part of the Sunni region of both countries, the border that had been there, which was, as you know, it's artificial to begin with, that border's gone.
Isn't it also an incontestable fact that bears mentioning that Saddam Hussein and his regime were deposed and justice was brought to him?
They were. And I think ultimately, and you're right that this is a counterfactual, will be when you weigh that and the slaughter he had committed, the brutality of his regime, against the chaos and bloodshed since. How do you weigh those? And either way, you're talking about two tragedies. You're talking about tens of thousands, of hundreds of thousands, perhaps under Saddam, hundreds of thousands since we were there. That's a judgment that I don't relish those having to make.
And there are those who argue that whatever mistakes of planning and execution the Bush-Cheney administration committed in Iraq, that by the end of that administration, following the surge, they had left Iraq in a lot better shape than it is today. And that to just call the entire experience the Iraq War and not carefully apportion accountability to the different administrations, meaning the Obama administration in this case, is to do a disservice to the history and to the service personnel. What do you say to that?
I mean, I think that is sort of the narrative it tells itself. We were talking a moment ago about Vietnam and a feeling in the military that it was lost for reasons not having to do with them, but having to do back home. You are hearing that same thing. You're hearing we had gains. They were frittered away. They were allowed to evaporate. And if they hadn't been allowed to evaporate, what Iraq is today would not be what it was in 2009 and 10. There would have been a difference, that the one didn't necessarily lead to the other. And I think you're right. You're beginning to hear those voices today. You will hear them a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. I think that will become the dominant narrative in the military about the Iraq War and what happened since.
Was Barack Obama a good commander-in-chief? Is he a good commander-in-chief?
I genuinely don't know how to answer that. In the same way that defining what is good, what is bad, because we don't know a year from now what is Iraq.
Is he an effective commander-in-chief?
Also a tough one, because we can look at individual choices. Afghanistan has not gone off the rails as badly as people had feared. U.S. troops are coming back. The death toll and the human cost has shrunk. Iraq is a disaster. But I think we as a country tend to give ourselves too much credit and too much blame. When we invaded in 2003 and the civil war that was unleashed, the ferocity, I remember seeing bodies in the streets with drill marks, people who had been drilled to death because they were Sunni or Shia, burned to death because they were Sunni or Shia. And we said, well, that's because of us. No, we had mistakes, but Iraqis had a hatred within them that was never solved by Saddam, who was always there, and we helped unleash it, but we took all the blame on ourselves. We didn't deserve it. Flash forward, when the surge happened and violence fell, we took a lot of the credit. We didn't deserve all the credit either. A lot of that was because a lot of Iraqis, exactly, the Sunnis said, these al-Qaeda, what they are doing is too disgusting, it's too repulsive, we will turn on them. I think we tend to take too much blame and too much credit, which makes it hard to evaluate in the moment if a given president was good or bad.
Our visitor to the Foxhole today has been Yoki Dreesen, managing editor of Foreign Policy and author of The Invisible Front, Love and Loss in an Era of Endless War, published recently by Crown. It's the story of a distinguished military family struggling to cope with the deaths of two sons, one killed in Iraq, the other a case of suicide, and their effort to change the culture of the United States military. You should read this book. That'll do it for this episode of The Foxhole. You can follow me on Twitter, @JamesRosenFNC. We will FNC you next time.